When an 11-year-old boy stands frozen by the classroom doorway long after the final bell, his teacher's gentle question sends a chill through the entire room. What began as an ordinary school day quickly unravels into something far darker, a hidden truth that endangers not only the boy, but those who dare to help him. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe every secret deserves to be brought to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Miss Carol Reynolds rubbed her tired eyes as the last of her students dashed into the corridor, their laughter echoing against the metal lockers. She had spent her entire afternoon grading math quizzes and planning next week's lesson on local history. It was a Thursday, ordinarily one of her quieter days, but her mind was anything but settled. Something about Lucas Bennett had lingered with her for weeks. She could no longer ignore the growing knot of concern in her stomach. At first, it was just a subtle feeling that he was staying behind for reasons he refused to articulate, always wearing that worried, distant expression. But on this particular afternoon, as the rest of the class hurried off, Lucas simply froze in place. His posture was tense, as though he were bracing for a catastrophe. "Lucas," she said softly, sliding the graded quizzes into a neat stack on her desk. "Are you all right? It's time to go home." She expected him to mumble something about a forgotten lunchbox or a missing assignment. Instead, he ducked his head and clutched the strap of his backpack so hard his knuckles turned white. "I can't go," he murmured, voice trembling just enough to send alarm bells through Ms. Reynolds's heart. She stood up, crossing the short distance between them with careful steps, remembering full well how easily spooked the boy had been these last few weeks. "What do you mean you can't go?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. She thought she might coax an answer from him, or perhaps he would break down and reveal some typical childhood worry. Maybe he had lost the bus pass or had gotten in trouble at home over a low test score. She would handle it, she told herself. She was his teacher. She had seen many students with anxieties about parental punishments or sibling arguments. But Lucas's silence cut deeper than mere nerves. He swallowed, and she watched him press one hand to his arm, just where his sleeve ended. "I just can't. I want to stay here." His words reminded her, suddenly, of a past heartbreak, a student she once had named Eric, years ago, who had slipped through the cracks. She could still see Eric's timid smile on the day he sat for his final test, after which he never returned to school. His father had pulled him out, and the whispers of abuse behind closed doors were never fully addressed. By the time authorities checked on Eric, it was too late. Ms. Reynolds had lived with that guilt for years. So, her heart pounded as she peered into Lucas's eyes. She caught sight of something raw and terrified, something that told her the stakes were far higher than a bad grade. "Lucas, I can't let you stay here all night," she said softly. "Is there something you're afraid of at home?" In that moment, he met her gaze, and although he looked away just as quickly, she caught a glimpse of tears brimming. "Please," he whispered, "please don't make me go." She hesitated, uncertain of the legalities. Still, she had to do something. Memories of Eric tormented her. She placed a hand gently on Lucas's shoulder. "Let's talk for a moment," she said. "We'll see if we can figure something out." Lucas let her guide him back into the room, where she switched on the overhead lights and closed the door. Outside, the hallway bustled with the usual after-school cacophony, kids shouting to each other, footsteps echoing, the clatter of lockers. This was the time parents came to pick up younger children. Soon, the building would begin to empty. Lucas sat down in a chair near her desk. He seemed smaller than ever, an 11-year-old who suddenly looked 6. She noticed something she had not really registered before, faint bruises peeking out at the edge of his sleeve. When she saw them, she felt a tense squeeze in her chest, as though her heart clenched itself in fear. "Lucas," she said, trying not to let the tremor in her own voice show. "I see you might have gotten hurt. Can you tell me what happened?" He simply shook his head. "It's nothing," he said. "I fell." She nodded slowly, recognizing the scripted, mechanical tone she had heard from children in denial or those coached to conceal the truth. "Are you sure? I'm here to help you, Lucas. You can trust me." Still, he refused to speak. Ms. Reynolds found herself thinking back to any possible sign she might have missed, times he had stayed behind in class, rummaging through his backpack to stall, or those weary smiles he would give her as if to say, "Don't notice me." She remembered how she spotted him flinching once when a classmate bumped into him in the lunch line. Each memory now seemed like a neon sign screaming that something was very wrong. Later that evening, after the school had officially closed, she finally coaxed Lucas into allowing her to call his father David Bennett. But Lucas pleaded with her, tears in his eyes, not to dial that number. "He's never home," the boy insisted. "Please." She ended up leaving a message on a presumably seldom-checked voicemail. Next, she tried child services, nervous, heart pounding. She knew the system had protocols, and bruises alone were not always enough unless she had firm evidence of consistent abuse or a child's confession. The last time she had called about Eric all those years ago, they took down her report but said there was little to do without direct testimony or something more concrete than a teacher's hunch. She hoped times had changed, or at least that Lucas's situation would elicit immediate action. The phone call was disheartening. A polite-sounding agent told her they would look into it, but that no official response could be made until further documentation was provided, pictures, medical records, or additional eyewitnesses. Ms. Reynolds's voice shook with frustration, though she tried to maintain composure. She looked at Lucas while she spoke, wanting him to see that she wasn't giving up. "Yes," she told the agent, "I'll do what I can to collect." "Yes, of course I understand." She hung up, her stomach roiling with dread. She was walking a thin line. She could get in trouble for stepping outside her professional boundaries, but letting Lucas vanish into the night with bruises and fear in his eyes was unthinkable. Finally, she convinced Lucas to let her drive him home, as the school's aftercare program was closing. He only agreed under her promise that she would walk him to the door, that she would see who was home with him. She half expected some confrontation on the doorstep. But when they arrived at a modest one-story house with a tidy lawn, the lights were off. No car in the driveway, either. Lucas pulled a key from his pocket and stared at it like it might burn him. Ms. Reynolds waited awkwardly by his side, the sun dipping low and painting the street in purples and oranges. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. "Are you going to be okay alone?" she asked quietly, resisting the urge to hustle him back into her car and take him somewhere safe. But legally, she couldn't just kidnap him either. She was at a loss. "I'm used to it," Lucas said in a hollow voice, unlocking the door. "My stepmom works late sometimes. My dad too." In the fading light, Ms. Reynolds thought she saw a shadow flicker inside the house, like someone peering from behind a curtain. But when she tried to focus, the window was still. "All right," she managed to say, heart heavy with uncertainty. "Promise me if anything happens, you'll call me. And tomorrow, I'd like you to come see me at lunch, okay?" He nodded, eyes lowered. Then he vanished inside, closing the door gently behind him. She stood on the porch for a long moment, the hush of the suburban evening settling around her. She had an uneasy feeling, as though someone behind that door was watching her, waiting for her to leave. Eventually, she turned back, got in her car, and drove away. Every few blocks, she contemplated pulling over and calling the police right then. But she knew she had no concrete evidence to show them. She felt the old frustration creeping in, the same despair she felt when Eric's father sweet-talked social workers into dropping the case. With a trembling breath, Ms. Reynolds swore she would not let this slide. That night she hardly slept. Memories of Eric merged with the present image of Lucas's panicked face. She rose at dawn, exhausted but resolute, and decided that if child services required evidence, she would find it. No child in her care would suffer in silence. She would investigate everything she could about Lucas's home life. She would speak to staff, see if the school nurse had noticed anything, gather testimonies from other teachers. She refused to be idle. By the time school began the next day, Ms. Reynolds was nursing a half cup of cold coffee and scanning through her emails. There was the usual staff chatter about curriculum and an upcoming parent-teacher conference day. Then, she spotted a note from the administrative assistant. "Ms. Reynolds, please see me regarding a call from a Mrs. Cynthia Bennett." Ms. Reynolds felt a jolt of surprise. Lucas's stepmother had called? She set down her coffee so quickly she nearly spilled it. Hurrying to the office, she met with the administrative assistant, who explained that Cynthia Bennett had complained about Ms. Reynolds overstepping her bounds by calling child services. The woman had apparently used phrases like unprofessional and won't stand for false accusations. Ms. Reynolds's cheeks burned with anger, but there was also a flicker of fear. Cynthia's reaction was so swift, so accusatory, it felt like a warning shot. If Ms. Reynolds persisted, Cynthia might lash out, and who knew what she would do to Lucas? The assistant seemed sympathetic. I told her to speak to you directly if she had a complaint. But she demanded to talk to the principal. He's out on a conference this week, so I left him a note. Ms. Reynolds thanked her, anxiety twisting her insides. She wondered if Cynthia had already confronted Lucas, punishing him for speaking to his teacher about the bruises. She dreaded what might happen behind closed doors. Gathering her courage, she decided to remain calm and professional. She needed to proceed carefully, lying low until she had more concrete evidence might be safer for Lucas in the long run. Still, she kept a vigilant eye on the school halls, hoping to catch Lucas that morning. He did not appear. Second period arrived, then third, and by lunch Ms. Reynolds realized Lucas was absent. She tried to hide her concern in front of the other students, but fear gnawed at her. Where was he? Had Cynthia prevented him from coming to school, or was he simply ill? The day dragged on, her lesson plans a blur. Each ring of the bell felt like a punch to the gut. By the time dismissal rolled around, Ms. Reynolds had convinced herself she needed to try again, call the house, maybe drive by if necessary. But as she was tidying up, a knock sounded at her classroom door. She opened it to see Mr. Hernandez, the school counselor, with a note in hand. "Heard you've been worried about Lucas Bennett," he said softly, stepping inside. "I just got this note from the nurse's office. They said Lucas's stepmom called to report he's out sick today. I was also told that you reached out to child services?" "Yes," Ms. Reynolds said, noticing the concern etched on Mr. Hernandez's face. "I suspect something is going on at home. Lucas is terrified to go back there. He's shown bruises and he's refusing to talk. Child services said they can't do much without more proof." Mr. Hernandez took off his glasses and sighed. He was an older man who had seen a lot of struggles pass through these halls, but there was something about Lucas's case that clearly stirred him. "We need to be cautious, Carol. If the stepmother is already angry, she might be capable of, well, anything. But I'm on your side. Let me see if I can schedule a home visit or push through the bureaucratic red tape. We might be able to have a social worker come by in an official capacity." Ms. Reynolds nodded, relief mingling with dread. She was not alone, at least. But she also knew how slow the system moved. Time might be running out. She recalled that flash in Lucas's eyes, the look of someone in immediate danger. An ache settled in her chest. She quietly thanked Mr. Hernandez for his help. That afternoon, on her way home, Ms. Reynolds couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. A maroon sedan seemed to appear in her rearview mirror for several blocks. She told herself it was nothing, maybe it was just a neighbor headed in the same direction. But when she slowed to make a turn onto a side street, the car slowed too, shadowing her. Her heart thumped wildly. Had Cynthia stooped to following her? Was it someone else entirely? Finally, she managed to lose the sedan by turning down a narrow street, but the experience left her rattled. Once she arrived at her small, cozy apartment, she double-checked the locks. She pressed her back against the door for a moment, trying to steady her breath. This was escalating faster than she anticipated. She wondered if she should call the police about being followed, but decided she had no concrete proof. The license plate was a blur in her anxiety. Still, her instincts told her she was now involved in something bigger than a mere suspicion of abuse. Cynthia was not only dangerous to Lucas, she could pose a threat to anyone who tried to interfere. Days passed. Lucas remained absent from class. Ms. Reynolds pressed the front office for more updates, but only heard that the Bennett household had called in each day, citing illness. Child services remained non-committal, offering no timeline. Mr. Hernandez did his best to expedite matters, but progress was agonizingly slow. Ms. Reynolds even tried calling David Bennett's work number, though she had no real reason to believe he would speak to her. She received a curt, "Mr. Bennett is in a meeting and can't be disturbed," followed by a voicemail prompt that never led to a callback. Each night, Ms. Reynolds found it increasingly difficult to sleep. She kept her phone by her pillow, praying Lucas might call in a moment of desperation. At the end of the week, she found a battered envelope slipped under her classroom door. Inside was a crumpled piece of lined paper, written in a shaky handwriting she recognized as Lucas's. It read, "I'm sorry. She's making me write things about you. Don't believe her if she says I lied. She is planning something. I don't know what to do. Lucas." It was as though the words were etched in Ms. Reynolds's mind, each sentence confirming her worst fears. She wondered if Cynthia had coerced Lucas into telling stories to discredit Ms. Reynolds or to keep her away. That mention of "she is planning something" made Ms. Reynolds's blood run cold. She imagined all manner of horrors. Mr. Hernandez studied the note grimly. "This is definitely from Lucas," he said. "The handwriting matches some of his old assignments." Ms. Reynolds rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar stirring of helplessness. "We need to get the police involved. You know they'll want to see real evidence of wrongdoing," Mr. Hernandez warned. "It's just a note, and it's not exactly a direct threat." "But I agree, Carol. We can't sit on this." She marched to the local police precinct that very afternoon, refusing to let her fear paralyze her any longer. She told a patrol officer everything: her suspicions of abuse, Lucas's bruises, the ominous note, Cynthia's anger, the fact that Lucas had vanished from school. The officer, a kind-faced woman named Officer Daniels, listened intently and typed up the report. Then she told Ms. Reynolds a detective would follow up soon. She advised Ms. Reynolds to be cautious, but gave no guarantee that the authorities would be able to get a warrant or forcibly remove Lucas from his home. "We'll try a welfare check," she offered. "But it helps if the boy or someone else can confirm immediate danger." Ms. Reynolds left the station with a sense of partial relief. At least the police were aware now. If something did happen, they would have a paper trail. But the notion of waiting for a tragedy to prove immediate danger was horrifying. That evening, Ms. Reynolds had just finished dinner, a bland microwave meal she hardly tasted, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She snatched it up, heart pounding. "Hello." A whisper came through the line. "Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." Her stomach lurched. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the call ended. Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone, her mind reeling. She knew it had to be Cynthia, or someone connected to her. She dialed back, only to find the number was out of service. Fear sank into her bones, but also a flare of determination. She refused to be bullied. She dialed Officer Daniels's contact at the precinct, left a message about the threat. Then she double-checked her windows and doors. She slept poorly, dreaming of dark hallways and echoing cries for help. Each time she jolted awake, she pictured Lucas's pleading face, heard his quiet voice begging not to be sent home. 3 more days passed with no sign of Lucas and no meaningful progress from Child Services or the police. Ms. Reynolds started to wonder if she should drive out to the Bennett's place herself, but she recognized the danger. She could be arrested for trespassing or get into a direct confrontation with Cynthia. Without official backup, it was too risky. Meanwhile, the principal returned from his conference, heard Cynthia's complaint about Ms. Reynolds's unprofessional interference, and called her in for a meeting. She arrived to find him seated stiffly behind his desk, the blinds half closed against the afternoon sun. "Carol," he began, lacing his fingers, "Mrs. Bennett has made some serious allegations. She claims you're harassing her family, spreading rumors of abuse. I told her I would look into the matter, but you need to be careful. If there isn't sufficient evidence, we can't have you violating a family's privacy." She bit back her anger, fighting to remain composed. "Sir, I have reason to believe Lucas is in danger. He's been absent for over a week. I've contacted Child Services and the police. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm trying to ensure a child's safety." The principal sighed, looking sympathetic yet trapped by procedural constraints. "I understand your concern, but we also have protocols. The school's role is to report suspicious behavior, not to launch our own investigation. Keep me updated on anything official you find. Until then, please refrain from contacting the Bennett household. Let the authorities handle it." She left his office feeling a swirl of frustration and dread. She was certain something terrible was happening, yet every official channel told her to wait or stand down. If something went catastrophically wrong, she would never forgive herself. The next morning, she arrived early to her classroom, scanning the hallway in vain hope that Lucas might appear. Instead, she spotted Mr. Hernandez by the lockers, his expression grim. He motioned for her to come closer. "Carol," he whispered, "I just received a message from an acquaintance at the police department. They went for a welfare check at Lucas's address last night. No one was there. Neighbors said the family left in a hurry the day before. They haven't been seen since." She felt her heart drop like a stone. They'd left? Where would they go? Mr. Hernandez shook his head. "No clue. It doesn't sound good. I'm sorry." She felt a surge of panic, and with it came an ironclad determination. "I have to do something," she said. "I won't let this boy vanish." That afternoon, Ms. Reynolds took a personal day off from school, hopped into her sedan, and drove across town to see if she could glean any more information from neighbors or maybe the father's workplace. She found only locked doors and uncertain shrugs. One neighbor recalled seeing Cynthia load some belongings into a car, looking agitated. Another neighbor recalled hearing raised voices late at night. Ms. Reynolds obtained no new leads on their whereabouts. She remembered the earlier incident with the maroon sedan that had followed her. Could that have been Cynthia's vehicle? She felt the prickle of paranoia, scanning for any sign of suspicious cars around the block. She found none. A little boy was missing, and no one but her seemed truly alarmed. The frustration nearly overwhelmed her. A week crawled by, each day heavier than the last. Then, just as Ms. Reynolds was finishing up an after-school meeting, her phone rang. She recognized the precinct number and answered at once. "Ms. Reynolds? This is Detective Sorensen. We might have a lead on Lucas Bennett." Her heart thudded. "Where is he?" she asked urgently. "That's what we're working on. We found a witness who spotted the Bennetts out near the highway. The father claims they're visiting family, but none of the father's relatives have confirmed that. We suspect Cynthia is hiding the boy somewhere else." Ms. Reynolds stared at the phone, her pulse racing with a mix of relief and dread. "Is there anything I can do?" "Keep your phone on," Detective Sorensen replied. "If you hear from them, let us know immediately. And if the boy tries to contact you, get as many details as possible." She thanked the detective, then sat in her silent classroom for a long time, gazing at the empty seats. She wondered if Lucas was cold, hungry, scared, somewhere remote, maybe even in a trunk or a shed, hidden away. The mere thought made her tremble with rage and sorrow. He had trusted her enough to leave that note. Would she be the one to save him, or would the system fail him again? That night, Ms. Reynolds stared at her phone as she lay in bed, flicking through her contacts. She was about to drift off when it buzzed, an unknown number again. She hurriedly answered. A small, whispery voice said, "Ms. Reynolds." Her breath caught. "Lucas? Oh, Lucas, where are you? Are you safe?" He swallowed audibly. "I'm sorry. I'm really scared. She's not letting me leave. I can't talk loud." Ms. Reynolds's heart pounded. She switched on her bedside lamp, fumbling for a pen and a notepad. "Lucas, do you know where you are? Anything you can describe outside? Or maybe you saw a sign on the way?" He hesitated. "It was dark, but I saw a sign for an orchard. I think it said something like Hawthorne Orchards. And it took a long time to get here from the highway. There's a big barn and I'm in a little room that looks old. She locked me in. She said if I tell anyone, I'll never get out again." Ms. Reynolds bit her lip to stifle a sob. "Lucas, stay calm. I'm going to call the police right after this. We're going to get you out, do you hear me?" He let out a shaky breath. "Yes, but she's going to check on me soon. She has a phone she took from me. I found this old phone in here. It only has a little battery left." She scrawled down the details. "Hang tight, okay? We're coming." The line went dead. She dialed Detective Sorensen immediately, adrenaline rushing. Through tears of frantic urgency, she relayed the orchard's name. She urged them to send units right away. The detective promised to put out an alert, though it was a large county, and there might be many farm properties. Ms. Reynolds refused to just sit by. She opened her laptop, searching for any orchard in the region named Hawthorne or something similar. Late into the night, she found mention of a defunct orchard called Hawthorne Groves, a property foreclosed years ago, rumored to have an abandoned farmhouse. Sleep was impossible. Early the next morning, Ms. Reynolds received a call from Detective Sorensen, who confirmed that Hawthorne Groves was on the outskirts of the county, set back from a winding rural road rarely traveled. "We have units headed there," the detective said briskly. "But we need you to stay put, Ms. Reynolds. This could be dangerous." She agreed, but her mind seethed with worry. She drove to the police station anyway, waiting in the lobby for any word. Hours ticked by. She paced, imagining every worst-case scenario, Cynthia taking Lucas away before the police arrived, or the boy being harmed. Then, at last, a flurry of activity. A pair of officers burst through the station doors. One of them gave Ms. Reynolds a thumbs up, a relieved grin on his face. "Got him," he said. "He's safe." She sank into the nearest chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. Her relief was so overwhelming she felt dizzy. Detective Sorensen approached, removing her hat with a sigh. "We found Lucas locked in a back room. Cynthia had tied him up. She was armed, but the SWAT team moved in quickly. She's been taken into custody." Ms. Reynolds closed her eyes, feeling tears of gratitude. He's not hurt? "A few bruises and malnourished, but alive and conscious. The paramedics are checking him over." Even in her relief, Ms. Reynolds felt a spike of anger at the depths of Cynthia's cruelty. She thought of how terrified Lucas must have been. But at least he was finally out of danger, alive and free. The detective assured her that David Bennett was also being questioned. It seemed he might have left the area after a dispute with Cynthia, or perhaps he had aided her in some way. Details were still unfolding. Hours later, Ms. Reynolds stood by Lucas's hospital bed, tears in her eyes. He looked so small in the crisp white sheets, and 4 in his arm. Bandages covered bruises on his wrists, likely from the ropes or cuffs Cynthia had used. His breath hitched when he saw her, tears shining in his exhausted eyes. She rested a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered, voice thick. "You're safe now." He blinked up at her and let out a quiet sob. "I was so scared," he said. "I thought I'd never see you again." Ms. Reynolds fought to keep her voice steady. "I wasn't going to stop until we found you," she told him. She brushed a stray hair away from his forehead. "No matter what, I promised myself I wouldn't give up." A nurse peeked in, checking the 4 drip, then left them alone. Ms. Reynolds gently asked about his injuries. Lucas explained in halting words how Cynthia had become more unhinged after Ms. Reynolds contacted Child Services, how she decided to drive him out to that farmhouse so he couldn't talk. "She said I was a burden," he muttered, looking away. "She said I needed to be quiet forever." A chill swept through Ms. Reynolds, anger swirling with sorrow. She leaned forward, pressing a tender kiss to Lucas's hair. "Listen to me, Lucas. You are not a burden. Do you understand? You're a brave boy, and none of this is your fault." He tried to hold back tears, but they spilled over. She stayed there, letting him cry softly, wishing she could erase the horrors he had endured. She promised him he would never go back to that house, that Cynthia would be behind bars for a long time. In the days that followed, Ms. Reynolds found herself in a whirlwind of legal processes. Child Services finally had a mountain of evidence against Cynthia, and David Bennett was found to have neglected Lucas, ignoring signs of abuse for fear of causing waves in his marriage. The local prosecutor assured Ms. Reynolds that charges would be filed swiftly. For once, Eric's memory felt less like a tragic weight and more like a reminder of what she had vowed to never let happen again. Meanwhile, Lucas was placed into temporary foster care while the case wound its way through court. But Ms. Reynolds visited him every day after school, bringing him books, stuffed animals, and homework so he wouldn't fall behind. She noticed the relief that washed over his face when he saw her, like her presence confirmed that everything was going to be all right. One evening, as they sat together in the foster family's living room, Lucas's social worker arrived with an update. She nodded at Ms. Reynolds, then glanced at Lucas, who was busy flipping through a battered copy of a fantasy novel Ms. Reynolds had brought. "We've arranged for Lucas's long-term placement," the social worker explained softly. "There's a family that might be willing to adopt him. They live in another district, but they have a stable environment." Ms. Reynolds felt a pang in her chest. She had grown so attached to him in such a short time. But what mattered was that Lucas found a good home. She forced a smile, telling herself to be happy if he was safe and cared for. Then Lucas placed the book down and said quietly, I don't want to go somewhere else. I want to stay with Ms. Reynolds. She's the only one who didn't give up on me." Ms. Reynolds blinked, her heart twisting. She saw the social worker's eyebrows rise, and Ms. Reynolds cleared her throat. "Lucas, you know, it can be complicated," she said gently, unsure if she could even qualify for adoption. Yet the thought of him leaving her life pained her deeply. Over the next few weeks, that seed of an idea grew in her mind. Maybe she could adopt him. She had a steady job, a humble but comfortable apartment. Would the state let her? Eventually, it became clear that the social worker was open to the possibility. Ms. Reynolds met with attorneys, filled out reams of paperwork, and faced a rigorous background check. It was a daunting process, but every time she hesitated or doubted, she remembered the terror on Lucas's face and how he had called her from that locked room, trusting her to save his life. She couldn't abandon him now, not when he had so few people in the world he truly trusted. In parallel, the case against Cynthia progressed. Police discovered evidence of her forging documents related to Lucas's mother's insurance payout, as well as witness statements from neighbors about verbal threats and suspicious injuries. The local news ran a story about the teacher who had gone above and beyond to protect her student. Ms. Reynolds felt uncomfortable with the spotlight, but she did countless interviews, hoping that maybe the attention would help other children in danger. In the coverage, she saw glimpses of David Bennett, pale and haggard, claiming he never knew Cynthia was that extreme. Ms. Reynolds suspected he was complicit in his own cowardly way. At last, the trial began. It was a harrowing few weeks, with Lucas having to testify briefly via recorded statement, so he didn't have to face Cynthia in person. Ms. Reynolds testified as well, describing her experiences and the note Lucas had left her. Cynthia tried to claim Ms. Reynolds manipulated Lucas for attention, but the mountain of evidence was too high to ignore. Cynthia glared daggers at Ms. Reynolds across the courtroom, but Ms. Reynolds stood firm, remembering Eric, remembering all that had brought her to this moment. It took the jury less than a day to return a guilty verdict on multiple counts of child abuse, kidnapping, and fraud. Cynthia was sentenced to a lengthy term in prison. Lucas learned of the verdict that evening, tears slipping down his cheeks as Ms. Reynolds told him. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders, holding him as he processed it all. She was relieved that he would never have to see that woman again, but she also recognized that the emotional scars would remain. "We'll work on this together," she assured him. "We'll see a counselor, and I'll be there for you." He wiped his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved me." The adoption process finally neared completion after months of anticipation. Ms. Reynolds couldn't quite believe it was happening, that she might soon be Lucas's legal guardian. She painted the spare bedroom in her apartment a soft blue, let Lucas help pick out a desk, some posters for the walls. He wanted superhero themes, and she was more than happy to oblige. She caught him smiling to himself sometimes, a shy, contented grin that made her heart ache with gratitude and love. On the day the adoption was finalized, Ms. Reynolds took Lucas to the courthouse, dressed in his best shirt and slacks, and they stood before a judge who made it official. Ms. Reynolds fought tears as she signed the final papers. Lucas's small hand clung to hers, as though checking to see if this was all real. Afterward, they went home, truly home. They had a modest celebration, just the two of them, with balloons and a pizza in the living room. Lucas looked around at the apartment, now his home, and let out a long breath. "So, I'm really staying?" he asked, still hesitant. She nodded, tears prickling her eyes again. "You're my son now. As long as you'll have me." He gave a tremulous smile, then hugged her tight. She closed her arms around him, Remembering the day she first saw him linger in the classroom doorway, fear etched in every line of his posture. This moment felt like a miracle. She realized how much she loved him, this brave boy who had endured so much. In the following weeks, Lucas began attending therapy, working through nightmares of the farmhouse and Cynthia's threats. Ms. Reynolds supported him every step of the way, and though he had occasional flashbacks, each day he seemed a bit more at ease. He also returned to school, yes, the very same school by his own choice. He insisted he wanted to stay near Ms. Reynolds, though they agreed he wouldn't be in her homeroom class to avoid any awkwardness. Still, he felt safer in that building, around teachers he knew cared about him. One drizzly morning, Ms. Reynolds watched Lucas bound off the school bus with an almost excited energy, wearing a new jacket and carrying a new backpack. It was a far cry from the haunted boy who had once refused to go home. A sense of peace warmed her chest. He deserved this fresh start. A year later, Ms. Reynolds could hardly believe how far they had come. Lucas had grown taller, discovered a love for drawing comic book heroes, and made new friends. She was proud to attend a small award ceremony in which Lucas was recognized for an art project he had done depicting the importance of speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves. He explained that it was inspired by his own experiences, though he didn't go into the darker specifics. Ms. Reynolds sat in the front row, applauding through tears as he accepted a certificate. Afterward, he sat beside her in the car, a shy smile on his face. "It's weird," he said quietly. "Sometimes I think about everything that happened, and it feels like a bad dream." She reached over and gently squeezed his hand, the memory of that bruised little boy still raw in her mind. "I know," she said, "but look at you now. You're strong. You're healing. And I couldn't be more proud." He nodded, leaning against the window, the afternoon sun gilding the edges of his hair. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." She blinked back tears. "Yes, you could have. You were brave all along. I just helped." A faint grin flickered on his lips. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. It was still somewhat new for her to hear him call her that, and each time it filled her with profound gratitude. She started the car, feeling a sense of fulfillment unlike anything she had known before. All the terror, all the heartache, they had arrived at a place of safety and love. It wasn't a perfect happily ever after, but it was close enough for them. In time, the nightmares receded, though Ms. Reynolds took every precaution to ensure that Cynthia could never threaten Lucas again. She kept a close eye on him for any sign of new trauma or trouble, but mostly he was just a bright, resilient boy eager to embrace the normalcy of life. On weekends, they played board games, explored the city's museums, went for walks in the park. Ms. Reynolds also connected with a small group of parents who had fostered or adopted children from tough situations, building a community of support that helped them navigate the complexities of trauma and healing. Still, once in a while, Ms. Reynolds would catch Lucas watching a television segment on missing children or reading a newspaper article about an abusive situation, and his face would grow solemn. She knew he was thinking about how close he came to an even darker outcome. Each time, she would remind him, "You're here and you're safe." And each time, he would smile a little, thankful. The day eventually came when Ms. Reynolds and Lucas decided to share their story publicly, giving an interview to a local journalist who wanted to highlight the shortcomings of the system that nearly failed Lucas, just as it once failed that other student, Eric. Lucas spoke with a quiet confidence, grateful to Ms. Reynolds but also calling for better protections for children in precarious home situations. The journalist wrote a compassionate piece, focusing on hope and the possibility of change. Ms. Reynolds wondered if she was doing the right thing, exposing Lucas's past. But Lucas insisted, saying, "If there's another kid out there like me, maybe this will help them speak up sooner." She couldn't argue with that. She only prayed that the next teacher or neighbor or friend who noticed suspicious bruises would act quickly, maybe even more quickly than she had. And so life continued, a new chapter for mother and son. The darkness that Cynthia brought into Lucas's life receded into memory. The legal battles closed, the final appeal attempts from Cynthia's lawyers squashed by overwhelming evidence. David Bennett disappeared somewhere out of state, disowned by both Ms. Reynolds and Lucas alike. If he ever tried to re-enter Lucas's life, The boy had the full backing of Ms. Reynolds and a protective order to keep him safe. Months and years slid by in relative peace, peppered with ordinary milestones. Lucas's graduation from elementary school, then middle school, and eventually high school. Ms. Reynolds watched him grow taller than she was, watched him develop a love for the arts, watched him make friends who understood him. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and her mind wandered, she would think of how things could have ended differently, if Lucas hadn't found that spare phone, or if the farmhouse had been truly abandoned. She shuddered at the very idea. Yet here he was, alive and well, turning into a compassionate, empathic young man determined to help others. One Sunday afternoon, as they were enjoying a movie marathon in the living room, Ms. Reynolds noticed Lucas's expression. He looked at her with a mix of fondness and lingering disbelief, as if still amazed that someone had taken him in, loved him, and refused to let him slip away. She reached for his hand in a casual, familial gesture, and he squeezed it back. "I'm so lucky," he said under his breath, eyes still on the television screen. "All things considered, I'm really lucky." Her throat tightened. "We're both lucky," she said. "We found each other." They continued watching the movie, leaning into that comfortable silence only family can share, where words aren't always necessary to convey understanding and gratitude. For anyone who watched their journey unfold, who saw the battle waged in the shadows of systemic inertia and parental betrayal, Lucas's story stood as a testament to the power of one determined teacher who refused to look the other way. It showed how a single moment of bravery, a phone call from a locked farmhouse, a note slipped under a door, could spell the difference between tragedy and salvation. And it offered hope that sometimes, when the system moves too slowly, individuals can rally together to protect a child who has no one else to rely on. In the end, Lucas's healing and newfound life with Ms. Reynolds was more than just a personal victory. It was a reminder that there are so many children yearning for someone to stand up for them. Ms. Reynolds still thought about Eric from time to time, wishing she could have done then what she managed to do now. Perhaps saving Lucas didn't erase the regret, but it gave that sorrowful memory a purpose, to galvanize her into action when the stakes were high. If even one life was rescued from the jaws of cruelty, then it was all worth it. Eventually, as the years stretched on, Lucas reached an age where he began to consider college. Ms. Reynolds, older now, found herself in the peculiar position of both pride and wistfulness. He had outgrown the quiet boy who lingered in the hallway. He was confident, passionate, ready for the next step. The bond they shared would never diminish, though, and in every small achievement, every on a test, every artistic accomplishment, she saw the reflection of a boy who had once been locked away, waiting for someone to save him. His future was bright. He dreamed of studying social work or psychology, hoping to help kids facing what he had faced. Ms. Reynolds was happy to see that spark in his eyes. It was the flame of resilience, burning away the shadows left by Cynthia's cruelty. At the close of it all, as they ended another day in their comfortable home, Ms. Reynolds smiled as she switched off the living room lamp. Lucas, now taller than she, gave her a quick hug goodnight. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly, and she knew he meant for everything, for the perseverance, the love, the unwavering belief in his worth. She locked the door, peered out into the quiet street, and whispered her gratitude for the chance to make this difference. Every struggle, every heartbreak had led them here. And in her heart, she hoped that their story could inspire others to act, to refuse to remain silent in the face of a child's pain. Thank you for watching and listening to Lucas's story. If you believe in standing up for what's right, be sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate each of you for taking the time to be part of this journey. And remember, truth always has a way of coming to light, especially when we shine a light ourselves.